class, welcome back to Introduction to Ethics. I hope you're doing well today. Last time we finished our look at capital punishment, and today we're going to move into our next topic, which is war, violence, and morality. Stay tuned.
Study war, violence, and morality. And just some introductory material. In 2003, the United States launched an invasion of Iraq. That's obviously the Iraqi War of 2003. And there was much debate over this war and if the United States had the right to invade Iraq and the reasoning behind it. And we're not going to go into those reasons. But the point was that in 1991, Saddam Hussein had invaded Kuwait, and we went in with the coalition of forces in 1991, the Desert Storm, or the first Gulf War, and we kicked Saddam Hussein and the Iraqi forces out of Kuwait, and they went back to Iraq, and that pretty much ended that war. But then in 2003, the United States went and invaded Iraq for the different reasons. I'll just get one example. Was that there was the accusation that Saddam Hussein was stockpiling weapons of mass destruction, and so there was there was other reasons also. But the point was that we invaded this other country, and there was a lot of debate over this. Well, one of the points of concern was whether that war was moral, and it brings that moral question up. And of course, we've been fighting wars in the United States since the beginning. We just go a time, and then there's another war, and go another time, and then there's another war, and some more time, and another war. And you just look at our history of it, and it raises the question about, is war a just thing? Is there such a thing as just war? And so, as Christians, the debate over morality, it's set against the backdrop of the Old Testament. Okay, so let's look here. War in the Bible. In the Old Testament, the nation of Israel and war. Of course, as Christians, you should be reading your Bible and in the historical and narrative accounts in the Old Testament, the historical books, and you'll find this throughout the Old Testament. Israel finds itself engaged in multiple wars. In each case, Israel does so at the command of God. So God is leading the nation, and He is leading them at times into war. And we see this for several hundred years. Everything from the Exodus into the Promised Land and into the monarchy. There's wars that are fought. God sanctioned Israel's wars for multiple reasons. So God's sanctioning for the war was to secure Israel's boundaries, to defend themselves with national defense. So they're defending themselves. And then number three, that there were wars and they were aggressive in nature. For example, when Joshua crossed over the Jordan River with his forces, and they fought the war campaigns of Joshua, and that's a really interesting study in itself. If you just look at the southern and the northern campaigns, military campaigns of Joshua. So these wars were aggressive in nature. However, just because God commanded Israel's wars in the Old Testament does not mean that war is justified for today. And so that's where we get into debate, and it's among Christians, the debate of if someone should be a pacifist or if someone should go to war. And it's just because it's in the Old Testament doesn't mean like, oh, okay, everyone, let's all go out there and we're just rattling the sabers and we're war happy. But this is what we have to mull through. That's why it's an ethical issue. So let's look at the New Testament. War on the national scale was not addressed since the church is not a national identity. Okay, so that's pretty much self-explanatory. Old Testament was the nation of Israel, and in the New Testament under Roman rule, really it's not addressed on a national scale because the church is not a nation. Secondly, Christians were a persecuted minority in the New Testament. So it's not like the military was all made up of Christians and off they go to fight some holy war for God. No, the Christians were a persecuted minority. Most Christians in the early church did not join the Roman military. And the reason was because of idolatry. Now, there were Christians, there were those in the Roman military that got saved, so a Roman soldier, accepting Christ, but it was not that there's Christians in the church, and they just feel this call to join up, and they go and join the Roman legion, and off they go to war. Christians, for the most part, did not join the Roman military, and it was because of idolatry. They had to swear an oath to Caesar, and basically Caesar was worshipped, and so Caesar would have been an idol. Now, there's an interesting point here, that first yellow highlight. Because of this reasoning, this does not equal a call for pacifism. So just because the early church didn't have a lot of Christians in the ranks of the military, that doesn't mean it's a call for pacifism. Like today we look back, it's like, well, there weren't Christians in the Roman military, so we shouldn't have Christians in our military. So it's not a call for pacifism. And then what's important here at the bottom of the screen is personal use of violence is addressed in the New Testament. And we're going to look at this in some upcoming slides. But my point is that it's personal use of violence. What that means is this does not equal, so this is the bottom yellow highlight, this does not equal the government's role in war. Okay, so when we look at the New Testament, there's a look at personal ethic and personal use of violence, personal use of vengeance on somebody, personal use of revenge, going after somebody yourself. That's definitely spoken against in the New Testament, but that does not necessarily equal the government's role in war. And then it goes a little further, or the Christian's involvement in the government or the military. So basically, if a Christian is under the authority of the government, or they're actually even considered a role in the government, or they're in the military itself, then what happens when that government orders the Christian off to war? Well, that's where you have the just war theory and Christians falling on that side, that it's under the authority of the government, which again, God has placed the government there, and under the authority of the government, the Christian can be involved in government and the military as long as it meets the just war criteria, which we're going to look at. So we see here that there's going to be pacifists in the church, and there's going to be those that believe war is okay under certain circumstances, also in the church. It's just that where does one ethically and personally fall on that? Okay, so we have two moral views of war, and so this is going to be the two sides. The first is the pacifistic side, and the second is the just war theory side, which we'll get to. So number one, pacifism. It takes several forms, basically two forms, but all agree that participation in war is never justifiable. Okay, so they say, it doesn't matter. Pacifists say you should never be in war. Now, there's two types of pacifists. The first is the nonviolent pacifist. That's number one down there towards the bottom, nonviolent pacifism. It precludes the use of violence in any form, so the person does not go to war, but may support work and support war efforts, like making weapons or conducting medical services. And there's even stories of people in the military that they're pacifists, and so they take a non-combatant role, like a medic or maybe a chaplain or something like that, where they're not involved in actually firing weapons at the enemy. So nonviolent pacifism. And then there's number two, non-participation pacifism. And this is more extreme by not allowing for individuals to even be involved in anything, to include indirectly in actions that support war efforts. So this would be the person that is, war is wrong, never participate in war, you don't make weapons, you don't support it in any way. So that's the non-participation pacifist. And then our second moral view of war is number two there, just war theory. Okay, so this is where someone would say war is okay, but as it says there on the screen, participation in war can be acceptable under certain circumstances. Okay, now there are three main points for the just war theory. Number one, war is only justifiable when war is undertaken in self-defense. Number two, preventative strikes are justifiable to ward off imminent attack. And then number three, wars intended to reverse cases of injustice are acceptable. So those are three main points of the just war theory. Now we're going to get into more detail of just war theory and the criteria for war, But these are the three main points that if it falls under these types of things, then war is okay. Now we're going to just shift just a little bit, and we're going to look at each one of these in a little more detail. And we're going to look at pacifism first, and then we'll look at just war theory. Pacifists insist that all uses of violence, particularly the use of lethal force, cannot be justified. And this includes war, and it even goes to the point of self-defense. And there's even religious groups that are, as a group, are pacifists. So it's not just a personal decision. It's an actual group. So, for example, like the Amish that mainly are in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and they're kind of spreading out a little bit more in the United States. But the Amish are definitely pacifistic. They say you should not participate in government, you should not be in the military, the government should not go to war. It's all it's a pacifistic society. So that's an example there. And even the self-defense part, where if an Amish person got struck or punched or something, they should. And so they would not even defend themselves personally. Pacifists disagree whether pacifism should be a personal doctrine or also applied to society. So some say it should just be your personal choice, and society can do its thing, but you don't participate in that. Or there's other pacifists who say our society should be pacifistic. And so that would be actually an example of the Amish. The Amish society, if you're in the Amish order, you would not even participate in it. Christian pacifists ground their arguments in several central passages of Scripture, including these passages here on the screen. And we don't have time to get into these, but you can look them up later on your own if you want to, because some of the passages are kind of long, and the context to really work through the context of it would be quite time-consuming. But I just did want to mention that Matthew 5:38-48. So this is the Sermon on the Mount, and Jesus is teaching on retaliation and then loving your enemies. Also Luke 6:27-36, loving your enemies. That's Jesus' teaching there. Romans 12:19-21 is Paul's teaching on vengeance. And then 1 Peter 2:18-24 is Peter's doctrine on non-resistance. So there's a couple passages there in the New Testament, and pacifists root themselves in these passages. And the thing is that does it mean, is it a personal, individual command to love your enemy, or is it for the government to love their enemy? And then if it's not the government's job to love their enemy, in the case of war, what does the Christian do who is in the military? So Jesus is teaching that commands believers to love their enemies. Jesus teaches this, to love your enemies, so a Christian cannot go to war. How can you love your enemy when you're trying to kill them? So the pacifist says it's inconsistent with going to war, so and then you would follow Jesus' command first. So that's the pacifist argument. And they use these scriptures to ground their argument. So critiques of pacifism. So this is what the person that's not a pacifist would say to a pacifist. And it really comes down to the use of violence. So pacifism obviously means you don't use violence pretty much for anything, not just in war, but pretty much for anything. And what it comes down to, it is counterintuitive and unrealistic when involving loved ones. So we get to this verse here in Mark 12:30-31 that basically talks about loving your neighbor, and then who is your neighbor? Well, your neighbor is basically anyone outside of yourself. Your neighbor could be your person that lives next door to you. It could be the person across town. It could be an unbeliever who is your neighbor. It could be your family member. It could be your child. It's anyone pretty much outside of yourself. And so when you think about this, it would not be loving to let others be abused when it could be stopped. So Mark 12:30-31 says, "And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. This is the first commandment. And the second, like it, is this: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There was no other commandment greater than these." And so obviously this is Jesus saying, responding to the Pharisees, and he's telling them the greatest commandment and then the second commandment. So love God and love your neighbor. So if your neighbor is being attacked and you're standing there watching it, are you loving your neighbor by not stepping in to help them or stepping in to stop the attack? And if the attack is one of lethal force, should you step in and use lethal force to stop that attack? And so the critique against pacifism would be that it's counterintuitive, unrealistic for society to basically work if you just stand back and watch people in your society who are innocent being killed by a violent person. So the question comes down to, and especially about being counterintuitive, what if your spouse or your child was being attacked, especially in a lethal way? What if they were being attacked? So let's just say the spouse. So I'm a husband, and if my wife was being attacked, it's like it completely goes against my intuition to just watch my wife be attacked, and I just stand there and allow that to happen. Or a child. No, and even biblically, you could say it would be the husband's job to protect the wife, and that would be a example of loving your wife. So and also with a child, it would be you're stepping in and you're loving your child and you're protecting your child. So to stand there and watch your child being attacked and not doing anything about it, it's counterintuitive. And especially if it comes to lethal force, if someone is trying to kill the spouse or kill the child. So it would basically go against what one would even believe. You need to step in there and protect. The very last bullet point there, it says protecting school children and a YouTube video clip. Now, I cannot insert the YouTube video clip into this video because it'll be a violation of copyright, but that does not mean you can't watch that video clip. And so in Moodle, I'm going to put the link for a YouTube video clip, and it's of a woman protecting it. It's actual footage, and it's kind of graphic because it is violent. It's a woman protecting school children. And so I'm going to put that clip in Moodle so you can click on it and watch it like we usually do. But I just can't insert it into this video because YouTube is going to scan the video and they'll flag that and not allow the video to be published because of copyright. So make sure you watch that video after this. Okay, so continuing with critiques of pacifism, the question is, what about Hitler? That's obviously the big name for someone that did just horrendous things in the past. What about Hitler? What about using violence to protect Jews and to protect vulnerable nations? Because if you look at history, if there's any time that someone needs to step in with military, with violence, with war to protect nations and even in this case the Jews, it would have been during Hitler's time. So what about him? Well, what happened was there was a group of people that saw the need to take out Hitler. And it was the July 20th, 1944 assassination attempt of Hitler. And that's where Hitler, he was at the Wolf's Lair. He was in the room discussing the planning with his generals, and he went guy in the resistance, he was actually a military officer named Stauffenberg. His last name was Stauffenberg. He he planted a bomb and detonated it, and that ended up killing and wounding people in the room, but not Hitler. Well, this attempt, it actually was quite a large and elaborate system. And there was a lot of people involved because they were going to try to overthrow the government also. And there's actually a movie about that called Valkyrie, starring Tom Cruise. There was a lot of people involved. What I'm getting to is this guy here on the screen named Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and he was a theologian. And as I'm recording this right now, looking ahead at my bookshelf in front of me across the office here, I have several books by Bonhoeffer and his writings. Well, Bonhoeffer was he was a pacifist. He believed in nonviolence, and he said that nonviolence is a cost of discipleship. So if you become a disciple of Christ, then a cost of that is you're going to give up violence. Yet he was involved in this attempt to kill Hitler. And what he did was he came to, in his mind, so you have a pacifist who basically said, there's a time that, you might have to do something to stop an evil. And he saw himself caught between two evils, the use of violence and taking out Hitler. And he saw the danger of pacifism if you just let pure evil go unchecked. Now, what he did was he chose the lesser quote unquote evil. That's what he said. He chose the lesser evil and reasoned that it was his moral duty to act to support this movement. Now, it must be known that he did not plant the bomb. He was just part of the resistance, and he was actually caught up in it, in the whole movement. And just continuing with this slide here, the bomb went off, and you see there in the big picture of the room where the bomb exploded. And what happened was Hitler there on the right. You can see him there. I'll put my arrow above him. So that's Hitler there, and he's showing Benito Mussolini, who was in charge of Italy. He was the dictator in Italy. He came to visit, and Hitler was showing Mussolini the room, that how he survived. And Hitler said it was Providence that allowed him to survive. Okay, but so that's just a picture. I just wanted to show you that, the historical picture of it. But Bonhoeffer, because he was involved in this assassination plot, he ended up being arrested and then placed in a prison, and then he was hung on April 9th, 1945 for his involvement in the plot to kill Hitler. And this was actually 21 days before Hitler ended up killing himself in the bunker in Berlin. So you see that pacifists can even reevaluate their position and see, you know what, under this circumstance, this is just pure evil, and it would be immoral if I did not stop it. That's what Bonhoeffer, his conclusion was. If you want to read a really good book on Bonhoeffer, there's a picture of it that I took and put on there. It's called Bonhoeffer, Pastor, Martyr, Prophet, and Spy by Aaron Matexas. Excellent book. I have it on my shelf, and I've read that. It is an excellent book talking about Bonhoeffer and his ministry, and then obviously what he did during World War II that led up to his involvement in the assassination plot for Hitler. Okay, so those were a couple critiques of pacifism. But what about just war theory? Now, this is going to be the theory that someone that says war is okay under specific circumstances will follow. So just war theory. The just war tradition goes back to the time of Augustine, but was not developed until the Middle Ages. So it was not like just war theory was in the early church, in the book of Acts, and it wasn't something more recent. It was basically goes back to the early church fathers, especially Augustine, and then during the Middle Ages, as the Roman Catholic Church, which basically controlled a lot of society in the Middle Ages, as they went on holy wars, they went on the Crusades, they started developing these ideas of that war is just. And advocates of the classical view hold that war is justified under certain conditions. Specifically when it is in response to unprovoked aggression, and then other just war advocates justify preventative wars and wars to reverse clear injustices. So we're going to talk about this here briefly. Now, when we look at the just war theory, we need to look at the word just. So what is the justification for the classical just war tradition? And we have 7 reasons. We have 4 here on this screen, and then we have 3 on the next one. The 4 on this screen fall under a category called jus ad bellum, which basically is the criteria for going to war. Okay, so the first 4 reasons, it's the criteria for going to war. Now, when we look at the criteria, number 1, it must be prompted by a just cause. So it's not something that, a dictator is just like, hey, let's invade this other country because of whatever reason. It must be a just cause. So, for example, in the United States, it would be the attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. We were not at war with Japan, and we were not at war with anybody, actually. We had stayed out of the war in Europe, which started in 1939, and the Japanese, the naval fleet came across the Pacific, and at the right spot, they sent their airplanes off their aircraft carriers, and the Japanese airplanes bombed Pearl Harbor, and you've seen the pictures of it and all of that, the USS Arizona blowing up and sinking, and all the other battleships that were attacked. And it was basically, the war was prompted because of this attack on us. So it's prompted by a just cause. Number two, it must have just intention. So what does that mean? Just intention means that when the war is over, there should be the ability for a fair peace for all involved, for the good guy and the bad guy. There should be a fair peace that can be involved. So the intention is go in, solve the problem through war, and then get back to a level playing field, or I should say a peaceful grounding for all nations involved. What this does, this rules out national revenge, economic advantage, and ethnic cleansing. So it gets rid of all of those. So again, it's not a nation just going and having revenge on another nation. It's not, a country has some sort of natural resources that can help us economically, so we'll invade them. So that was one of the critiques about the Iraq War, was in 2003, was that it was over oil. We invaded Iraq because of oil. The just intention gets rid of any kind of economic advantage. And then also ethnic cleansing, of course, that's going to be immoral. And the intention would never be to just cleanse the country of some people group. So it must have a just intention. Number three, it's of a last resort, which means all diplomatic efforts have failed. Everything politically, national leaders, government officials, the diplomats, they've done everything in their power to stop any kind of aggression. And if at the last resort, then finally it goes to war. So it is a last resort. Number four, a formal declaration by properly constituted authorities. Now, this is where we get into a little bit of a sticky situation, let's say in the United States, because the last time that an actual declaration of war was made was in 1941 by our Congress, who declared war on the Empire of Japan. So a formal declaration by the constituted authorities must take place. Legitimate and highest government body declares the war. Okay, so it's like our Congress declares the war. So when our country went to war against the Empire of Japan in 1941, President Roosevelt he addressed Congress, and he asked Congress to declare war, and Congress did. They declared war on Japan. That was the last time we actually had a declared war. So when we looked at the war, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the other actions we've been involved in with, in the 1980s, there was Grenada and there was Panama, and then there was the first Gulf War, which was called Desert Storm, and then we have the Iraq War after 9/11, and in 2003 we have the Iraq War, and then 9/11 we went into Afghanistan and the war in Afghanistan. All of these things that I just mentioned, there was never a declaration of war. They were always given reasons for why it was justified, whether it be a police action or to stop aggression from somebody else or to remove Saddam Hussein from Kuwait. There was always reasonings for it, but there was never a formal declaration of war. And then down on the bottom there of the screen, you see that a formal declaration is by a constituted authorities, meaning like a government body. It's not an individual that does it, like a dictator, or the president just doesn't go and declare war. A faction in the country, let's say in the United States, a faction doesn't just go and declare war. Paramilitary groups, they don't go and declare war. It's going to be the actual governing body that declares the war. Okay, so now we're going to continue on, and we're going to look at the last three justifications for war, and that's under jus in bello, which is criteria for how to conduct war. So once you go to war, well, then you just can't do whatever you want. So the just war tradition says it's okay to go to war, but you must follow these three conducts. Number 5 in our list of 7 justifications is that there's limited objectives. Destruction of enemy combatants, military, and crippling their offensive capabilities is okay to do. You can attack the military, attack the opposing army and their military. That's okay. However, there should be no total annihilation and wholesale destruction of the people the people of the country, the non-combatants, and even their infrastructure. It's one thing to bomb a bridge and take a bridge out to stop the military. It's another thing to destroy and bomb a hospital that's in the city that is treating the people. So, and I know you can mince words, well, what if the enemy combatants have gone in the hospital? But what happens is if you start getting into where it's just total annihilation, then really you've left the objective to stop the military, and now you're just destroying the people. And then after the war, the people should have capability to rebuild their infrastructure and society. And so when you start looking at the total war in World War II, where it was just city after city, especially in Germany, but also in Japan, firebombing of Tokyo, and then the atomic bombs in Nagasaki and Hiroshima, then you start getting to where the whole social fabric has been destroyed. And there was reasonings for that that kind of destruction in World War II. There's reasonings given, but there should be limited objectives for the going in and how you're conducting the war. Number 6, conducted with proportionate means. The force used should be proportionate to the threat that there is. So this includes the victim nation's response to the attack. So, of course, when Pearl Harbor was bombed, the United States declared war. Well, the response to Pearl Harbor was appropriate response. It was our military against their military. Now, at the end of the war, there are some people that said we should not have dropped the atomic bomb because that was never seen before. It was just such a massive bomb. But at the time, after Pearl Harbor, the response was appropriate. This includes the victim nation. So if the victim nation has let's say nuclear power, and they're, let's say an Air Force base or a military base got bombed, you wouldn't respond with nuking all of their cities. Okay, so the enemy's cities. So there has to be a proper response. Critics of just war theory point to nuclear weapons. This is the critics of just war theory. This is their point that they really hammer away on, is that if there's wars going on today between soldiers on the ground shooting small arms such as handguns, AR-15s, AK-47s, shooting rockets at one another, artillery, there's tank against tanks, whatever. That nuclear weapons is just way too more powerful than any of that. And so there's no possible way a nuclear weapon would proportionally the same as ground soldiers, so that you shouldn't use nuclear weapons. And then number 7, respect non-combatant immunity. So civilians, wounded soldiers, and POWs, they should never be attacked in the just war theory. And this includes NBC weapons, which are nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons. So again, nuclear weapons are out of the picture because as soon as you drop a nuclear weapon on a city, you just vaporize millions. Honestly, of a huge city with millions of residents, you've just vaporized millions of civilians and non-combatants. Same thing with biological and chemical attacks, where you set off a chemical weapon and the gas or the chemical kills a bunch of civilians. And again, wounded and POWs under the Geneva Convention would fall under being protected status, so you couldn't use violence against wounded or POWs. Okay, so this is the 7 reasons or justifications for the classical just war tradition. Proponents of the just war tradition point out that once you accept the basic position of just war theory, it may be difficult to stop with the traditional just war doctrine. So even the proponents of just war, they say just war is okay for these 7 reasons, but once you go that route, it actually can be hard to stop, and it may spread. And that opens doors to things like preventative strikes. Now, preventative strikes under just war theory are okay, but it's just how far and what reasoning will be given for a preventative strike. Now, there's an example. The Six-Day War in 1967 is definitely looked at as a just war preventative strike. Israel did not wait for the enemy, which was Jordan, Syria, and Egypt, to cross into Israel. I mean, the enemy was coming their way, and Israel was like, we're not waiting for them to come into our country. And so Israel attacked them first, and Israel won that war in 6 days. So that is an example of how just war theorists say a preventative strike is okay. But the problem is that who says something is okay? Is it when the military was on the move towards Israel, which was the case here, or was it, the military is massing on the border, or the government has called up their reserves? And so then next thing you know, next thing you need to figure out, so it's just is when that preventative strikes takes place, because then it could just actually go to where the country is basically attacking the other country and saying it's preventative, when really they weren't trying to stop anything of real immediate threat. They could still do things like diplomatic actions to try to stop any kind of aggression diplomatically. Next, it opens doors to wars to reverse injustices perpetuated by hostile, aggressive nations on vulnerable nations. If it's okay to use war to prevent, such as the 6-Day War, then it would be okay to use war to reverse. And so an example of that, which is looked at as a just war, is the Gulf War, aka Desert Storm in 1991, the action where Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, and he was in Kuwait for a little while. We went in, the United States led the coalition to reverse that action and kick Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait. But then what happened was, especially with the war in 2003, the Iraq war in 2003, is that people said we should have taken Saddam Hussein out back in 1991. And we should have taken him out of leadership and destroyed their government and set up a different government and all of that. That we should have done it in 1991. And what happens is, where it says opens the door to, is that the 2003 war, it looked like, well, we're just going in and picking up where we left off. And we kind of pushed that door open more. It opened the door for us to then invade another country. So that's where there was a lot of debate over this. And it's like, where does this injustice perpetrated by a hostile, aggressive nation on a vulnerable nation, where does it end? Because we thought it ended in 1991, but then it picked up again in 2003, where we were the ones that invaded Iraq. So it can cause a problem there. And then the problem number 3 there on the bottom of the screen is the use of torture for, basically for information to save lives, and it can be possibly justified with this. And so the idea there is waterboarding. So it opens the door there, and waterboarding was used to get information, and it's basically where it makes a person feel like they're drowning when they're not. They won't drown, but they're pouring water on them, and it makes them feel like they're going to drown. And that was looked at as unethical, and it's difficult to stop some of this stuff once the traditional war doctrine starts, because it opens the door to maybe you can use torture to get information to save lives. Okay, so that's our look here at war, violence, and morality.
Okay, class, that's it for today. Next time we'll be looking at sexual ethics. I'll see you then.